Hey, what's up you guys? Welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Christina and I am a reseller on the POSHMARK and Etsy apps. You can find me on Instagram at little.black.hanger. You can also find me on POSHMARK at littleblackhanger without the vowels, and you can find me on Etsy at Altera Vita Vintage. As you saw by the title, today's video is going to be about identifying vintage clothing. I'm so excited about this. You guys know I love vintage. I love to sell vintage on POSHMARK. I love vintage everything, clothing, home decor, all the vintage, love it. And I get a lot of questions asking how I know something is vintage, so I decided I would go ahead and do this video. Now this video is going to be about determining whether something is vintage or not. This isn't going to be a video about dating vintage, so basically where you determine what decade that your item is from. I will be making that video, but today's video is just going to be an overall gist of things that I look for to determine whether something is vintage or not. Tip number one is to look at the tags, and I'm going to spend some time on this first point because for the most part, tags will tell you everything that you need to know. So the first thing I look at is the brand tag, and I have a couple examples right here to show you guys. A lot of times you can tell by the style of the tag. It's very like decorative. It's kind of over the top. Typically modern brands have more minimalistic tags. They're pretty skinny. They're not large tags. And you can usually tell by the typography. So this is a vintage tag. The typography is large. It's big. It's over the top. It's not necessary for a tag to be this big. You know what I mean? So that's definitely an indicator that this item is vintage without even like looking further into it. I have another example. Here's another example of a vintage tag. You can tell by the font that it's just an older style font. That's something that is easy to pick up on, is the brand tag. Another thing that you want to look for is made in the USA. So if I flip this up like this, I will see right there that it says made in the USA. Now, this isn't a surefire thing that an item is vintage because yes, there are still some garments that are made in the USA, but it's very rare. And seeing something like this where it says made in the USA and you can just tell by this tag that it is vintage. So that is something to keep an eye out for. Another thing you want to keep an eye out for is a union tag. There are all different kinds of union tags, and a lot of them will say ILGWU, which stands for International Ladies Garments Workers Union. I know that's a mouthful. So that right there tells me that the garment was made between the 1920s and the 1980s. There are different styles of this tag, different logos. Depending on what style the union tag is will help you determine what decade that the garment is from. We'll get into that in a future video. So the next tag that I look for is a lot number tag. Now this was like an inventory system. It helped companies figure out which batch of garments were going to which store. And it just simply looks like this. It just says lot number and then, or a lot and then a number right after it. They stopped doing this in 1979, so if a garment has a lot number on it, it is most likely before 1979. Alrighty, so let's talk about care labels or the lack thereof. Care label is the label that tells you how to care for your item, so it tells you if you should machine wash it, if you should dry clean only, things like that, and those were not introduced until 1971. So if an item is missing a care label, that could be why. Fabric labels are the same way. Fabric labels were not introduced until 1960. So again, if it is missing one and it was very clearly not cut out, that means the garment was made before 1960. And the last thing to keep an eye out for with tags and labels is a brand label redesign. This is a picture of a modern Ann Taylor tag, and this is an older style vintage Ann Taylor tag. You can see that the font is a little bit bigger, the coloring is different, the tag underneath says made in the USA. A lot of times you can tell what decade an item is from based on what the brand label looks like. A lot of brands went through redesigns. We will get into that in a future video. I will leave down in the description box below a website called Vintage I think it's called Vintage Fashion Guild. They have a library of vintage tags and what decade each tag is from based on brand. So you can use that as a resource for figuring out what decade your item is from. The second way that I figure out if an item is vintage or not is just simply by the style. Shoulder pads is a good indicator that it is vintage, or any type of like poofy shoulder. You can tell by certain colors, certain washes, like with denim, the acid wash was very popular in the 80s and 90s. You can tell by the silhouette of a garment. You can tell by the cut of a garment. So I would definitely recommend going on Pinterest and looking at vintage clothing and getting yourself more familiar with the styles during different decades. That will help you out a lot. That's one of the first things that catches my eye when I am out looking for vintage is the style and obviously the tag of the garment. My third tip is look at the construction of the garment. So what I mean by that is if you see a dress, does it have a lining? Because lining in dresses and skirts was not introduced until the 1970s, because before that women wore slips, so there was no need for a lining. So that's one thing that you can look out for. Also zippers, look at the teeth of the zipper, not the actual zipper part, but the teeth. If the teeth are metal, it was most likely made before 1963. After 1963, plastic zipper teeth were made available. So that's some things that you can keep an eye out for when examining a vintage garment. My fourth tip is to look at the fabric. For me, I know what vintage fabric looks like and I know what it feels like. So I can tell just by looking at this dress and by touching it that it is vintage. Very popular vintage fabrics were polyester, nylon, lycra, acrylic, pure rayon, 100% rayon is a pretty big indicator that it is vintage. And another popular one is acetate. It's a very fragile fabric, but it feels a lot like polyester. So that's just some fabrics that you can look out for. Wool was another one that was pretty big. And tip number 5 is to look at the sizing. If you're a reseller and you're looking at clothing all day long, you pretty much have a good idea of what modern sizing. I can look at a pair of jeans that's a size 4 and tell it's a size 4 without even looking at the tag. We measure clothing all day long. You get a feel for what modern sizing is. So with that being said, a size 12 in the 50s, a size 8 in the 70s, and a modern day size 4 are all pretty much the same thing. They all are the same. So if an item is labeled size 8 or even size 12 and you can tell like this is a size 4 or even a size 2, that's a good indicator that it is vintage, because sizing was just so different back then. So that is another good indicator that something is vintage. Another thing with sizing is the use of half sizes. Now, I personally haven't ran into this, but just doing some research on the internet, I have seen that this was a thing. So let's just say, for example, it says 12 and a half, but it's on, we're not used to seeing that unless it's on a pair of shoes, right? But if you see that on a clothing tag, it's most likely pre-1970s, but it's no earlier than the 40s. So in the 1940s, half sizes were introduced into sewing patterns for shorter women. So it's to indicate that the garment is a little bit shorter. It was also used to indicate plus sizes, apparently, when it starts at size 20 and a half. So 20 and a half and more indicates that it is a plus size item. So I thought that was pretty interesting. That leads me into my next point, which is seeing odd numbers on a vintage garment. So like 3, 5, 7, and 9, which we now know as juniors or preteen sizing, but on vintage garments, it was actually used to indicate that an item was a petite size. So I thought that was pretty cool. Little fun fact of the day. All right, so those are my top 5 tips for determining whether a clothing item is vintage or not. I hope you guys learned something. If you have any tips or tricks that you use to determine whether something is vintage, let me know down in the comments below. All right, so as you guys know, I like to end all of my videos with an inspirational quote that one of you guys sends me. All you have to do to be a part of this is leave an inspirational quote down in the the comments below along with your Poshmark closet name so that I can shout you out in the video that you are featured in. And today's quote comes from Shamarly, I think is how you say her first name. And her quote is by J.M. Barrie, and the quote is, "Always try to be a little kinder than is necessary." I love that. Always treat people with kindness. And her Poshmark closet name is Itty Bitty Pretty, and I will leave that on the screen as well as linked in the description of this video so you guys can go check her out. Go give her a follow, share her closet, and show her some Posh love for that amazing quote. If you like this video, please be sure and give it a thumbs up on your way out. If you haven't already, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and join our family. We would love to have you. I put new videos out every Tuesday and Friday, and I will see you guys on Friday. Bye, guys.